The night shift was always the hardest. Officer Tom Chen stifled a yawn as he cruised down the quiet streets of Pine Valley, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the autumn fog. It was nearly midnight, and the small town had settled into its usual peaceful slumber. The radio crackled only occasionally with routine check-ins from other officers, and Chen was already dreaming about the warm cup of coffee waiting for him back at the station. Just as he was about to turn onto Oak Street for his final round, dispatch broke through the silence. Unit 247, we've got a call about strange noises coming from 1456 Maple Drive. Caller is Mrs. Reynolds from next door. Says she's been hearing unusual sounds for the past hour. Chen straightened in his seat, his drowsiness forgotten. Mrs. Reynolds wasn't known for making unnecessary calls. In fact, in his 5 years on the force, he'd never received a complaint from her. She was the kind of neighbor who brought cookies to welcome new families and kept an eye on everyone's kids during summer afternoons. Copy that, he responded, already turning his car around. Any details about the nature of the sounds? The dispatcher's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Caller describes it as, well, she's not quite sure. Says it's like crying but also singing. She mentioned she wouldn't normally call, but something about it feels different from regular noise complaints. As Chen drove through the residential streets, his mind ran through possibilities. He'd handled hundreds of noise complaints over the years. Teenagers playing music too loud, dogs barking at shadows, TV volumes turned up too high by elderly residents who'd forgotten their hearing aids. But something about this call felt different. The neighborhood was one of those classic American suburbs where everyone knew each other, where Christmas lights stayed up a little too long, and where kids still rode their bikes until streetlights came on. Number 1456 was a house he passed countless times, a well-maintained two-story home with blue shutters and flower boxes that changed with the seasons. Tonight, though, there was something different about it. The porch light cast a soft glow over the front steps, and through partially drawn curtains, he could see flickering lights inside, not the steady blue of a television, but something warmer, more uneven. Chen parked his car and stepped out, immediately hearing what had prompted Mrs. Reynolds' call. The sound was unlike anything he'd encountered on patrol before. It floated through the night air, a melody that seemed to carry both joy and sorrow, intertwined with what could only be described as heartache. Walking up the garden path, he noticed the flower boxes were still beautifully maintained, full of autumn chrysanthemums. But there was something about them that caught his eye. They were arranged in perfect pairs, as if whoever planted them was used to creating balance, used to thinking in terms of two. The sound grew clearer as he approached the front door. It wasn't threatening or alarming, but it carried such raw emotion that Chen felt his own heart responding to it. He'd been trained to maintain professional distance, to approach every situation with careful objectivity, but 20 years on the force had also taught him that sometimes the most important part of being a police officer was simply being human. He raised his hand to knock, but paused for a moment listening. The voice, for he could now tell it was a single voice, was singing words he couldn't quite make out, but the melody seemed familiar, like something from long ago, something that might have been sung in churches or at gatherings where people came together to share their joys and sorrows. Mrs. Reynolds appeared on her porch next door, wrapped in a housecoat. Her face showed concern rather than annoyance. "I'm sorry to have called so late, officer," she whispered, her voice carrying easily in the quiet night. "I know Mr. Wilson likes his privacy, but—" She trailed off, wringing her hands. "It's been going on for hours now, and it's not like him. Not like him at all." Chen nodded reassuringly. "You did the right thing, ma'am. I'll check on him." He turned back to the door, and this time he knocked firmly. The singing continued uninterrupted, as if whoever was inside was lost in their own world, a world where outside interruptions couldn't penetrate. He tried again, louder this time. Still no response. The flickering light continued to dance across the curtains, and now he could smell something too. Was that candle wax? The combination of the mysterious lights, the haunting melody, and the lack of response made Chen's police instincts kick into high alert. Following protocol, he walked around to the side of the house, using his flashlight to check windows for any signs of distress. When he reached the bay window of what appeared to be the living room, what he saw through a gap in the curtains made him reach for his radio, not in alarm, but because he knew he needed backup. Not for safety, but for something else entirely. Something that would remind him why he'd become a police officer in the first place. Through that window, he could see a scene that would stay with him for the rest of his career, a scene that would change not just his night, but the entire community's understanding of what it meant to be truly neighborly. Officer Chen's footsteps crunched softly on the autumn leaves as he made his way back to the front door. The scene through the window had stirred something deep within him, something that made his usual professional distance impossible to maintain. He'd radioed for backup, but his voice had been quiet, respectful. This wasn't an emergency, but it was important. Maybe more important than any call he'd responded to in months. The porch light cast long shadows across the welcome mat, worn from years of faithful service. A small wooden sign hung beside the door, hand-painted with the words "Music Lives Here" in faded blue letters. Chen noticed how the paint had been touched up several times over the years, as if someone had lovingly maintained this small declaration of what mattered most to them. From inside, the strange mixture of singing and crying continued. Now that he was closer, Chen could make out words, fragments of what seemed to be an old love song, the kind his parents used to dance to in their kitchen when they thought no one was watching. The voice would start strong, carried by memory and practice, then crack and fade into soft sobs before gathering strength again. The flickering light he'd seen earlier came from dozens of candles, not haphazardly placed, but arranged with purpose. Their warm glow spilled out onto the porch in gentle waves, creating patterns that danced across the wooden boards. The air was thick with the scent of vanilla and lavender, familiar scents that reminded Chen of his grandmother's house during special occasions. He knocked again, this time calling out gently, "Sir? This is Officer Chen with the Pine Valley Police Department. I'm here to check on you." The singing paused briefly, then resumed, as if the singer had briefly acknowledged the outside world before being pulled back into their own memories. Mrs. Reynolds had moved closer, still keeping a respectful distance but clearly concerned. "He's been alone since Margaret passed," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "They were always together, you know. 58 years of marriage. You never saw one without the other." Chen nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The perfectly paired flowers, the music sign, the candles, it all started to make sense. He reached for his radio again, but before he could speak, a young officer pulled up in another patrol car. Officer Lisa Park stepped out quietly, reading the atmosphere and matching her movements to it. "What do we have?" she asked softly, approaching the porch. Chen filled her in with quiet words, and something in her expression changed. She reached into her patrol car and pulled out a small flashlight, moving to check the other side of the house, while Chen continued his efforts at the front door. Through the window, they could see more details now. The living room walls were covered with framed sheet music and old concert programs. A piano stood in one corner, its top adorned with photographs spanning decades. A young couple on their wedding day, the same couple surrounded by students at a school concert, older versions of themselves at community events. Each photo told the story of a life built around music and love. The candles were arranged around a comfortable armchair where an elderly man sat, his silver hair neat despite the late hour, dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best. In his hands, he held what appeared to be a choir book, its pages well worn from years of use. Beside him on a small table sat a framed photograph, the glass reflecting candlelight like tears. Officer Park returned to the front, her face soft with emotion. "The back door's secure," she reported. "But I could see into the kitchen. There's a calendar on the wall. Today's date is circled in red. And there's a bowl of potpourri on every windowsill, lavender and vanilla." Chen closed his eyes briefly, pieces falling into place. Margaret's favorite scents, keeping her memory alive in every room. The circled date, an anniversary, perhaps, or maybe. A particularly heart-wrenching sob broke through the melody, and both officers shared a look. This wasn't a case for strict protocol. This was a moment that called for humanity, for understanding that sometimes the law enforcement badge they wore meant being guardians of not just safety, but of human dignity and compassion. Mrs. Reynolds had disappeared briefly into her house and returned. With one final shared glance between the officers, Chen reached out and tried the door handle. To their surprise, it turned easily, unlocked, as if inviting them into this private moment of remembrance. The hinges creaked softly, a sound that seemed to echo through the candlelit silence that had fallen as the singing temporarily ceased. The scent of lavender and vanilla grew stronger as they stepped inside, mixing with the warm smell of candle wax. The flickering light created dancing shadows on the walls, making the framed photos seem almost alive with movement. Each careful step they took deeper into the house revealed more details of a life well-lived, sheet music scattered across the piano, a pair of reading glasses folded neatly on a side table, 2 teacups on a tray, as if waiting for a conversation that could no longer take place. Officer Park hung back near the entrance, instinctively understanding that too many people might overwhelm the delicate atmosphere. Chen moved forward slowly, his footsteps muffled by a well-worn carpet that showed parts of frequent use, from the armchair to the piano, from the piano to the window seat, from there to the dozens of family photos that lined the walls. The elderly man in the armchair hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged their presence. His fingers traced the edges of the choir book in his lap, and now they could see tears falling freely down his cheeks, catching the candlelight like diamonds before disappearing into his neatly pressed collar. He wore a bow tie, slightly crook, and a suit jacket that had been carefully maintained, but showed signs of age, just like its wearer. "Sir?" Chen spoke softly, not wanting to startle him. "I'm Officer Chen. Your neighbor was concerned about you." He paused, then added gently, "The music is beautiful." For the first time, the man looked up, his eyes taking a moment to focus on the present, to return from whatever memory had held him so completely. "Officer," he said, his voice rough with emotion, but carrying the warmth of someone used to greeting others with kindness. "I hope I haven't disturbed anyone. Sometimes the music, it needs to be heard." Chen moved closer, carefully navigating between the candles. Now he could see the photograph on the side table clearly, a woman with silver hair and laughing eyes, caught in a moment of pure joy as she sat at the piano. The frame was polished to a shine, not a speck of dust allowed to settle on this precious memory. "My Margaret," the man said, following Chen's gaze. "Today would have been our 59th anniversary." He straightened in his chair, smoothing his jacket with trembling hands. "We met in the church choir, you know. She had the voice of an angel, still does, I expect, wherever she is now." A small smile touched his lips, even as fresh tears welled in his eyes. Officer Park had moved to speak quietly with Mrs. Reynolds at the door, their whispered conversation adding to the reverent atmosphere rather than disturbing it. Through the window, they could see other neighbors gathering quietly on their porches, drawn by the patrol cars but staying respectfully distant, their concern evident in their postures. The man, Mr. Wilson, Chen remembered from earlier, turned a page in his choir book with careful fingers. "Every Thursday for 58 years, we sang together, rain or shine, sickness or health. Even when arthritis made it hard for her to play the piano, she would sit right there," he pointed to the piano bench, "and sing with me. We never missed a Thursday." Chen noticed a small stack of letters on a nearby table, each envelope addressed in elegant handwriting to different members of the community. Understanding dawned. Mr. Wilson had planned this evening, had known it might worry his neighbors. The letters were likely explanations, perhaps even apologies for any disturbance. "Would you," Mr. Wilson hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Would you mind if I finished our song? Just this last verse." Margaret always said the last verse was the most important. It's where the hope is. His fingers tightened on the choir book, knuckles white with emotion. Chen glanced at Officer Park, who nodded almost imperceptibly. This wasn't in any police manual, wasn't covered in any training session. But sometimes being a police officer meant understanding that rules and regulations had to make room for human hearts. "I'd be honored," Chen said quietly, "to hear the end of your song." He carefully moved a few candles to sit in a nearby chair, creating a small space of shared remembrance in the warm light. Mr. Wilson's voice, when he began again, was stronger now, as if having someone to witness his tribute had given him new strength. The melody rose and fell, a love song that spoke of years spent together, of quiet mornings and gentle evenings, of a love that death itself couldn't silence. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Reynolds wiping tears from her eyes. Other neighbors had drawn closer, standing quietly in the garden, heads bowed as the music washed over them. Officer Park stood at attention near the door, her usual professional demeanor softened by the undeniable humanity of the moment. As the last notes faded into the candlelit room, Mr. Wilson closed the choir book gently, running his hand over its cover as if saying goodbye. "Thank you," he whispered, and it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to the officers, to his neighbors, to Margaret, or perhaps to all of them at once. Chen reached for his radio, but instead of calling in a resolution to the noise complaint, he found himself asking dispatch to send someone else to cover the rest of his shift. Some moments in life demanded more than just a quick response and resolution. Some moments needed to be honored with time, with presence, with the simple act of bearing witness to love that refused to be bounded by time or death. Chen glanced at Officer Park, who nodded almost imperceptibly. This wasn't in any police manual, wasn't covered in any training session. But sometimes being a police officer meant understanding that rules and regulations had to make room for human hearts. "I'd be honored," Chen said quietly, "to hear the end of your song." He carefully moved a few candles to sit in a nearby chair, creating a small space of shared remembrance in the warm light. Mr. Wilson's voice, when he began again, was stronger now, as if having someone to witness his tribute had given him new strength. The melody rose and fell, a love song that spoke of years spent together, of quiet mornings and gentle evenings, of a love that death itself couldn't silence. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Reynolds wiping tears from her eyes. Other neighbors had drawn closer, standing quietly in the garden, heads bowed as the music washed over them. Officer Park stood at attention near the door, her usual professional demeanor softened by the undeniable humanity of the moment. As the last notes faded into the candlelit room, Mr. Wilson closed the choir book gently, running his hand over its cover as if saying goodbye. "Thank you," he whispered, and it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to the officers, to his neighbors, to Margaret, or perhaps to all of them at once. Chen reached for his radio, but instead of calling in a resolution to the noise complaint, he found himself asking dispatch to send someone else to cover the rest of his shift. Some moments in life demanded more than just a quick response and resolution. Some moments needed to be honored with time, with presence, with the simple act of bearing witness to love that refused to be bounded by time or death. The next few hours passed in a gentle blur of stories and shared memories. The candles continued to flicker, though some had burned low, creating pools of warm wax that caught the light like tears. Officer Chen had pulled his chair closer to Mr. Wilson's, while Officer Park had quietly begun collecting fallen wax to prevent any fire hazards, her movements careful and respectful. "Would you like to see her?" Mr. Wilson asked suddenly, his voice stronger now. He reached for a leather-bound album that sat on a shelf near his chair. This was Margaret's pride and joy. She kept every program, every newspaper clipping. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing pages carefully preserved under clear plastic. The first photograph showed a young woman in a choir robe, her dark hair pulled back, standing at a piano. Her smile was radiant, and even in the old black and white image, you could see the joy in her eyes. "This was the day we met," Mr. Wilson said softly. "I was late to choir practice. Can you imagine? The only empty seat was next to her at the piano. I like to think it wasn't just chance." As he turned the pages, their life together unfolded like a beautiful song. There were photos of their wedding, both of them young and full of dreams. Concert programs where they had performed duets. Newspaper clippings about the music school they had started in their basement, teaching neighborhood children whose families couldn't afford regular lessons. She believed every child deserved music in their life, Mr. Wilson explained, pointing to a yellowed article. "We never turned anyone away. If they couldn't pay with money, they could pay with helping around the house or bringing vegetables from their gardens." Margaret said music was too precious to put a price on. Officer Chen found himself drawn to a particular photo, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson surrounded by a group of children, all holding small violins. "That was our first graduating class," Mr. Wilson said proudly, 1975. "Every single one of those kids went on to do something with music. One of them even plays for the State Symphony now." Mrs. Reynolds, who had been quietly making tea in the kitchen, returned with a tray. She moved with the familiarity of someone who knew this house well, navigating around the candles to set the tray on a small table. "Margaret taught my daughters piano," she said softly, pouring tea into delicate cups that clearly had years of stories behind them. "They still play, you know. Both of them. Their children are learning now too." Officer Park had finished her careful task with the candles and accepted a cup of tea. Her usual professional distance had softened, touched by the waves of love and memory that filled the room. "My grandmother used to sing in a choir," she offered quietly. "She always said music was the shortest distance between two hearts." Mr. Wilson's eyes lit up at this. "Margaret said something similar. She always told our students that music was the language of the soul." He turned another page in the album, revealing a photo of an elderly couple sitting at a piano, their hands overlapping on the keys, their faces turned toward each other in a moment of pure connection. "This was taken last year," he said, his voice catching. "Our last performance at the church. Her hands were giving her trouble by then, but she insisted on playing. Said she'd rather feel the pain and make music than feel nothing at all." He touched the photo gently, tracing the outline of their joined hands. The room fell quiet for a moment, filled only with the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional clink of teacups. Through the windows, they could see that more neighbors had gathered, forming a quiet vigil on the front lawn. Someone had brought chairs for the elderly ones, and they sat in small groups, talking softly, sharing their own memories of the woman who had filled their community with music. "You know," Mr. Wilson said, straightening in his chair, "Margaret would be so embarrassed by all this fuss. But she would have loved knowing that music brought us all together one more time." He closed the album carefully, but kept his hand resting on its cover, as if maintaining a connection to the memories inside. Officer Chen noticed a small stack of sheet music on the piano, the pages dog-eared and marked with penciled notes. "Did you choose special songs for tonight?" he asked gently. Mr. Wilson nodded, his eyes growing distant with memory. "Every piece we ever performed together. I started at the beginning. Our first duet choir practice. Been working my way through our life in songs." He gestured to the stack of music. "Each one holds a different memory. The lullaby we sang to our students' children, the hymn from our wedding, the Christmas carols we performed at the nursing home every year." A soft breeze through an open window made the candles dance, and for a moment the shadows on the wall seemed to move like dancers swaying to an unheard melody. Mrs. Reynolds quietly refilled teacups, and Officer Park moved to close the window slightly, protecting the fragile flames. "Would it be all right," Officer Chen asked carefully, "if I called someone? There's a grief counselor who works with the department sometimes. She's also a music therapist. I think Margaret would have liked her." Mr. Wilson considered this for a long moment, his fingers still resting on the album. When he spoke, his voice was stronger, more resolved. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I think Margaret would have liked that very much. She always said music wasn't meant to be a solitary thing. It needs to be shared, passed on, kept alive in new hearts." As Officer Chen waited for the grief counselor to arrive, he found himself drawn to the old piano in the corner. His grandmother had owned one just like it, tucked into the corner of her small apartment. The memory hit him unexpectedly. Sunday afternoons spent listening to her play, the smell of cooking rice mixing with the gentle notes of old songs from her homeland. "You play?" Mr. Wilson asked, noticing Chen's gaze. There was something knowing in his voice, as if he could read the memories written across the young officer's face. "My grandmother taught me," Chen replied softly, his hand hovering over the keys without touching them. "She passed away 3 years ago. I haven't played since." The admission caught in his throat, surprising him with its emotion. Mr. Wilson nodded, understanding filling his tired eyes. "Margaret always said instruments hold memories in their strings. That's why she never let me replace this old piano, even when the tuner said we should. Said it knew all our songs by heart." The gathered neighbors outside had begun to share their own stories, their quiet voices drifting through the windows like a gentle breeze. Mrs. Reynolds had opened her photo albums, showing Officer Park pictures of community concerts in the park, holiday performances at the local school, impromptu singing lessons on warm summer evenings. "Would you play something?" Mr. Wilson asked suddenly. "For your grandmother?" He gestured to the piano, its keys gleaming softly in the candlelight. "Margaret would have liked that, keeping the music going." Chen hesitated, his police training warring with the moment's gentle pull. But something about this night had already broken all the usual rules. He removed his utility belt, placing it carefully on a nearby table, and sat at the piano bench. The first notes were hesitant, rusty with disuse. But muscle memory is a powerful thing, and soon the melody of an old Chinese lullaby filled the room. It was simple, nothing like the complex pieces that usually danced from these keys, but it carried its own kind of grace. My grandmother sang this to me when I was small, Chen explained, his fingers finding their way through the familiar pattern. She said it was about the moon watching over sleeping children, keeping them safe through the night. Mr. Wilson closed his eyes, letting the gentle melody wash over him. Margaret would have loved learning that song, he said softly. She collected lullabies from around the world, said they were proof that love sounds the same in every language. Officer Park had moved to the window, watching as the neighbors outside fell quiet, listening to the unexpected music. Some had closed their eyes, others held hands, all connected by the simple notes floating through the night air. As the last notes faded, Chen felt tears on his cheeks. He hadn't cried for his grandmother in years, had pushed the grief down under layers of duty and routine. But here, in this room filled with another family's memories, his own loss felt fresh and somehow lighter for being shared. "Thank you," Mr. Wilson said, his voice thick with emotion. "You know, Margaret always said that grief shared is grief halved. But she also said that joy shared is joy doubled. That's why we taught music, to double the joy in the world." The door chimed softly, and Officer Park went to answer it. The grief counselor had arrived, a gentle-looking woman carrying a small bag. But before Chen could stand to make introductions, Mr. Wilson spoke again. Would you mind playing it once more? The lullaby." His hands twisted in his lap. "It's just that. Margaret always said music helps the heart remember how to beat properly when it's forgotten from grief." Chen nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As he began to play again, the grief counselor quietly took a seat, understanding that her work had already begun in an unexpected way. This time, as the melody filled the room, Mr. Wilson began to hum along softly, finding harmony in a song he'd never heard before tonight. Outside, a young mother rocked her baby in time to the music. Mrs. Reynolds wiped tears from her eyes, remembering her own children falling asleep to Margaret's piano playing. Officer Park's radio crackled quietly, but she switched it off without hesitation. Some moments demanded silence from everything except the music that brought healing. The candles had burned lower, creating soft pools of light that made the room feel like a sacred space. Chen's fingers moved more surely now across the keys, letting his grandmother's memory guide them. And as he played, he felt something shift in his own heart, as if by helping Mr. Wilson hold his grief tonight, he had finally found a way to hold his own. Word spread quickly through the small town about what had happened that night. By morning, the story had touched hearts in ways nobody expected. The police station's phone began ringing with calls, not of complaints, but of community members wanting to help. Officer Chen sat at his desk the next day, surrounded by notes and messages. An elderly music teacher offered free piano lessons to children who couldn't afford them, wanting to continue Margaret's legacy. The local church choir director called about starting a community music program. Even the high school band teacher reached out, suggesting a scholarship in Margaret's name. "You started something beautiful," Officer Park said, dropping another stack of messages on his desk. She'd stayed late after her shift, helping to organize the overwhelming response. "The chief wants to see you, by the way." "Don't worry," she added, seeing his expression, "it's good news." The police chief, a tall woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair, was waiting in her office. Family photos covered her desk, and a small radio played classical music softly in the background. "Officer Chen," she said warmly, "please sit down. I've been hearing remarkable things about last night." Chen settled into the chair, still tired from his long night, but filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The chief picked up a newspaper from her desk. There on the front page was a photo taken by one of the neighbors, showing the candlelit vigil that had formed outside Mr. Wilson's house. "This isn't just a story about a noise complaint anymore," the chief said, her voice gentle. "This is about community, about remembering what matters most. The mayor called this morning. She wants to start a community outreach program, connecting our offices with elderly residents who live alone." Chen thought about Mr. Wilson's face as he played his grandmother's lullaby, about the way music had bridged their different experiences of loss. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, already feeling ideas forming. "We're calling it Harmony Patrol," the chief explained, pulling out a folder. Officers would check in regularly with elderly residents, especially those who've recently lost spouses. But here's the special part. We want to include music. Community concerts, informal gatherings, maybe even music lessons. Your background with piano could be valuable here. As Chen looked through the proposal, his vision blurred slightly. There was his grandmother's photo next to Margaret's. The chief had done her research. "These connections matter," she said softly. "Sometimes being a good police officer means protecting more than just physical safety." Meanwhile, across town, Mr. Wilson's house had become a gathering place. Neighbors brought food, but more importantly, they brought instruments. A retired violinist from 2 streets over played a gentle sonata. A young girl brought her flute and performed a piece Margaret had taught her mother years ago. Mrs. Reynolds had organized a cleanup of the garden, replanting Margaret's beloved flower beds with help from the neighborhood children. As they worked, someone started humming one of Margaret's favorite hymns. Soon, others joined in, the simple melody carrying across the freshly turned earth like a blessing. Inside, the grief counselor sat with Mr. Wilson, looking through more photo albums. But these weren't just memories of loss, they were blueprints for the future. Margaret always wanted to start a proper music school, Mr. Wilson explained, showing her detailed plans drawn in Margaret's neat handwriting. She had it all worked out: scholarships, community concerts, lessons for anyone who wanted to learn. The counselor, who'd been taking notes, looked up with bright eyes. "These plans, they're still possible, you know. And now you have an entire community ready to help make them real." Back at the station, Chen was in a meeting with other officers, explaining his experience from the previous night. "It's not just about music," he told them, his voice passionate. "It's about connection. About remembering that behind every call, there's a human story." Officers who'd been on the force for decades nodded in understanding. Each had their own stories of calls that turned into something more, of moments when the badge became secondary to simple human presence. The local newspaper editor called, wanting to run a series of stories about community policing and the power of music to heal. But it wasn't just about the headlines, it was about the quiet revolution happening in people's hearts. As evening approached, Chen drove past Mr. Wilson's house on his way home. The candles were gone, but something else had taken their place: soft lamplight and the sound of voices singing together. Through the window, he could see Mr. Wilson at the piano, teaching a young boy the basics of scales while parents and neighbors watched, their faces glowing with something more than just the fading sunlight. Mrs. Reynolds stood on her porch, watering her flowers and humming softly. She waved as Chen passed, and he could see tracks of happy tears on her cheeks. Margaret would have loved this, she called out. All these years she was planting seeds. Now we're finally seeing them bloom. Chen thought about the Harmony Patrol program starting next week, about the music school plans being revived, about his own journey back to the piano. Sometimes the smallest calls led to the biggest changes. Sometimes a simple noise complaint could open hearts and heal wounds that had been silent for far too long. 1 year later, the small town gathered in front of a newly renovated building on Main Street. A bright blue sign above the door read, "Margaret's Music Haven, where every heart finds its song." The morning sun caught the polished brass doorknob, and flowers filled every windowsill, paired plantings, just as Margaret would have wanted. Officer Chen stood in his dress uniform, his grandmother's locket tucked carefully in his pocket. Next to him, Mr. Wilson beamed with pride, his bow tie perfectly straight today. The past year had been a journey of healing and purpose for both of them. The Harmony Patrol program had grown beyond anyone's expectations, touching lives across the community in ways no one could have predicted. "Ready?" Chen asked softly, offering his arm to Mr. Wilson. The older man nodded, straightening his shoulders. Together, they walked toward the entrance, where the mayor waited with a large pair of ceremonial scissors. The crowd of townspeople parted to let them through, many wiping tears from their eyes. Mrs. Reynolds stood in the front row, holding a photo album that documented the building's transformation. What had once been an abandoned storefront was now a warm, welcoming space filled with music and light. Every step of the renovation had been a community effort. Painters, carpenters, electricians, all volunteering their time, many sharing stories of how Margaret had touched their lives through music. The mayor stepped forward, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. 1 year ago, a simple police call reminded us what community really means. Today, we're not just opening a music school, we're continuing a legacy of love, healing, and harmony that Margaret Wilson started long ago. She turned to Mr. Wilson, handing him the scissors. Would you do the honors? His hands trembled slightly as he took them, and Officer Chen steadied him gently. Together, they cut the ribbon, and applause erupted from the crowd. Inside, the space was everything Margaret had dreamed of and more. The main room housed her old piano, lovingly restored and positioned near large windows where the morning sun could warm its keys. Smaller practice rooms lined the hallway, each named after a different type of flower from Margaret's garden. Photos and memories covered the walls, not just of Margaret, but of all the lives she touched through music. The first room was called Lavender Suite, its walls a soft purple. Inside, a young girl was already setting up her violin, preparing for the day's first lesson. Her teacher, the same student from Margaret's first class who now played with the State Symphony. Officer Park, now the coordinator of the Harmony Patrol program, led tours through the building. Every room has a story, she explained to visitors. And every story is about connection. She pointed out the community room where elderly residents could gather for weekly sing-alongs, the small library filled with sheet music from around the world, and the scholarship board listing names of children who would receive free lessons. In the center of the main hall, a wall of photographs told the story that had started it all, that night of candles and tears that had somehow bloomed into this moment of joy. There was Officer Chen at the piano, Mr. Wilson surrounded by caring neighbors, the spontaneous vigil that had formed outside. Below the photos, a simple plaque read, "Every heart has a song. Every song needs to be heard." The chief of police stood with other community leaders, watching as people explored the space. "You know," she said quietly, "we've seen a 40% decrease in calls about elderly residents in distress since starting the Harmony Patrol program. Turns out music really does heal." Mr. Wilson made his way to the piano, his steps stronger now than they had been a year ago. Officer Chen joined him, and together they sat on the bench. The room fell quiet as Mr. Wilson placed his fingers on the keys. The first notes of a familiar hymn filled the air, the same one he'd been singing that night, but this time there were no tears in his voice. As they played together, Chen caught glimpses of other healing happening around the room. A widow who'd barely left her house in months was swaying gently to the music. A troubled teenager who'd been caught vandalizing buildings last summer was now helping younger kids read sheet music. The mayor's young grandson, who hadn't spoken since his parents' divorce, was humming along softly. Mrs. Reynolds appeared with cups of tea served in Margaret's cherished teacups, now donated to the music center's small kitchen. She would have loved this, she whispered, watching the scene unfold. All of it. The day's official schedule included student performances, community singing, and the announcement of the first round of Margaret Wilson Memorial Scholarships. But the real magic happened in the quiet moments between, the connections formed, the memories shared, the healing that continued to spread through music. As evening approached, Mr. Wilson stood to make a speech. His voice was clear and strong, filled with purpose rather than sadness. Margaret always said that music was God's way of giving us a language for feelings too deep for words. Today, I understand what she meant better than ever. This place isn't just about teaching notes and scales, it's about teaching hearts how to sing again after they've forgotten. He gestured to Officer Chen, who had become like a son to him over the past year. Sometimes the most beautiful harmonies come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a moment of grief can open the door to a lifetime of joy. And sometimes he smiled, looking around at the community that had become his extended family. Sometimes the echo of one person's love can become a symphony that never ends. The day concluded with a community potluck in Margaret's garden behind the building. As the sun set, someone started singing her favorite hymn. Voice after voice joined in, creating the kind of harmony that can only come from hearts beating together in shared purpose and love. Officer Chen, standing at the back of the crowd, felt his grandmother's locket warm against his chest. He thought about how grief had led him away from music, and how grief, shared and transformed, had led him back. As the singing continued, he realized that this was more than just a happy ending to a sad story. It was a beginning. A new chapter in a song that would continue to touch lives for generations to come.